This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with art dealer, historian, author, and broadcaster Philip Mould. Philip has carved out a specialty as a dealer focusing on 500 years of British art, especially Tudor portraits, miniature portraits, and the early 20th century's Bloomsbury Group. Philip's knack for seeing the hidden value in long-forgotten works has made him a fixture on BBC programming, first as an analyst on the Antiques Roadshow, and later with his hit BBC One program Faker Fortune, which reaches up to 5 million viewers in the UK and greater numbers abroad, making it the most watched arts program on television. In the conversation, Philip discusses the realities of being an art dealer, the magic of portraiture, and the challenges one can face when trying to authenticate a long-lost work of art. And now, a conversation about finding value in the long-forgotten with Philip Mould. Philip Mould, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Philip, you move through the art world with a number of titles. You know, a lot of times with folks, I have them sort of start with a hypothetical, which is if you were to sit down next to someone at a dinner party. In your case, I'm sure you're never at a loss for words at a dinner party, but if you were next to someone who had absolutely no idea who Philip Mould was, where would you start to explain to them the types of things that you do?
I think a lot would depend on where the dinner party was, on what type of people surrounded me. I think I probably change or morph according to what the expectations are. But I'm an art dealer, though, in sort of real life, have been for probably 35 years. But I suppose the added bits are that I have written about art, and in particular art discovery. And from a relatively young age, I've also been involved in broadcasting in relation to painting and art and the art world. And most recently, by that I mean the last 13 or 14 years, I've been involved as the co-presenter of a program that I helped formulate called Faker Fortune, which is about discovering works of art, sometimes revealing them as fakes, and the processes that are involved.
You have a location in Pall Mall in London that could be described as an art gallery, but you're probably best described as an art dealer. Can you kind of describe the difference between the roles of an art dealer versus an art gallerist?
You're correct in observing that we do have a gallery, and a gallery brings with it all sorts of excitements and responsibilities, because you have a space that needs to function, has interface with the public, and needs tending. By that I mean you need to have a program of exhibitions very often in order to keep yourself relevant. You have a team of people rather than just possibly yourself and one or two others, because you need that, particularly for a reasonably large space that we have. And you use the gallery. Well, I mean, everyone uses a gallery in different ways, but as a gallerist, I rather like the idea of creating a place of conversation, of happening, of things that are allied to art as well as to do specifically with our inventory. And by that I mean I like to have sort of book launches and other types of event which somehow the art can play a part in and amplify your cultural presence or your aspirations.
In your case, the artists that we would find in your location, they're not necessarily contemporary artists that you're working alongside to create a narrative about their work. I mean, you're probably still creating stories and narratives, but the work that we'll find in there, it's more about the work and less about representing an artist. Is that fair?
Yeah, we deal in dead artists.
I was trying to say that a little bit more politely, but yeah.
So we deal in history, art history. We deal with individuals who, in some sense, shape, or form, have had an impact, who are probably rather more categorizable. You can place them rather more easily than living artists. And the overlap between what we do and what dealers do with contemporary artists is that sometimes even a dead artist who's made an impact needs to be readdressed. You need to find ways of exciting the public, if you feel they're worthy of it, with what they achieved. And so there's a bit of, I suppose you could say, retrospective PR.
As you manage that, as you represent these dead artists, how does that mechanism work? I mean, are you going out and finding and acquiring this art yourself that you then resell, or, is a certain amount of your work offering things on consignment?
So at any one time, we probably have about 100 works in inventory, that is, paintings that we have acquired, that we own. Sometimes we will sell things, particularly if they are very expensive, on behalf of a client, because it saves us actually having to buy them, which can be quite a burden to the cash flow of any business, as you might imagine. And I suppose if I was to explain how the process works, we will begin by trying to track down an interesting work of art. Let's say an early 20th century British portrait or landscape. And typically it might appear from a private collection. It could be from an auction somewhere. Sometimes other dealers come and contact us. I mean, we are known for doing 500 years of British art. And as a result of this, it sounds broad, but in fact, it's actually reasonably specialized. And as a result of that, sometimes people will come to us. Then we will look at it, we will consider it, we will see whether it fits into our stable of deceased artists. We will then consider whether it's affordable, it's worth buying, it's something that we can enrich and value add with. Sometimes it involves cleaning and restoration, very often indeed. I mean, all old paintings have been knocked around a bit one way or another, and sometimes they're discolored through dirt and through varnish and other things. And then we will go through the process of, which is actually an extremely significant one, and one I never feel I completely get right, which is the process of framing. With living artists, contemporary artists, although the dealer can sometimes have a very big part in this, at least that can come out of a dialogue with the artist. But it's rather difficult to divine what the artist would have intended when they're no longer around. And so what I then attempt to do is try and find something that is sympathetic, that expresses what the artist intended, something that also has a bit of zeitgeist to it as well. I mean, framing is as important as the clothes that you are wearing. And I'm looking at you on a screen now as we're talking. I see your white T-shirt and your check shirt, and I place you in a certain way as a result. And frames are similarly significant in expressing often the initial impact of a picture, the rules of engagement. And then there's the process of writing the painting up, making sure that it works online as a story, and the story is very significant. I mean, you can put all of the information and details about where a painting was exhibited, how it fits into the artist's work. But then you have to find a way, I think, and we have an obligation to do this as art dealers, to engage with people's imagination, to use some type of narrative to make it relevant and to excite and to stimulate people's consciousness for something that has been produced by a dead artist, sometimes a long time ago. And then we push it out to the public. So it's either on our wall. In fact, it's simultaneously on our wall, and we have someone who does digital media, whose job specifically, her name is Diana. His job is to get it out there to the world, to interest people, bring about conversations, get engagement. So that's basically how we work. We take something sometimes relatively underappreciated, and we represent it. We invest in it, and we try and make it relevant and attractive to as wide an audience as possible.
Well, I used to teach art history, and you really get engagement with your audience when they start connecting with a piece based on its context and storytelling, right? And I feel like that's part of the space that you have carved for yourself. For example, your current show, with the Bloomsbury Group, and there's a video on your website about the work of Tommy Tomlin. Maybe I never heard of Tommy Tomlin before. It's the same reason that whenever you watch the Olympics every 4 years, before every race, they're giving you 3 minutes of a profile on a particular athlete so that you become emotionally invested and, gain interest.
This is what we do in a sense where we try and act as ambassadors for artists who no longer have a voice, but whose work remains relevant. So take, for example, this exhibition we've got at the moment. The Bloomsbury Group were an extraordinary bunch of intellectuals, creative figures, highly progressive. They dismantled Victorian, early Edwardian England and paved the way to modernism in all sorts of forms. And it was rather wittily coined about them. They lived in squares, they painted in circles, and they loved in triangles. And they were an insular group. And we discovered recently, as a result of an invitation I had to a house in Fulham in London, where I then encountered this cluster of unknown sculptures. We were invited to connect with a man who long dead. He died, in fact, when he was 35, in the mid-30s, but was the sculptor, the sort of, if you want, sculptor in residence to the Bloomsbury Group. He was someone who this diverse group of intellectuals took to their heart and gave their faces to in the form of sitting to sculptures. And this was a story that hadn't been told. And his own life was a really tragic one. I mean, he died of drink and drugs. He was a manic depressive. A very complex figure, and one that touches the heart. But despite his fleeting and troubled life, he created a legacy of images of people like Virginia Woolf, Duncan Grant, Maynard Keynes, the great luminaries of this circle. And it was a story that had yet to be told. And we had the great good fortune of being able to be the people who could narrate this, because we had the works, we had the background story, we found film that included him. In fact, he was a bit of an amateur thesp. He loved playing a part. And so in a number of ways, we were able to, a lot of family photographs as well that we discovered. In a number of ways, we were able to bring this man to life, and so to add a richness and a comprehension and an emotional response to his art.
Well, the Bloomsbury Group, They sound like a pretty interesting bunch. It's quite a cast of characters that you have the fortune of presenting to people.
Indeed, and so the Bloomsbury Group is a classic example of a bunch of individuals who produced art. Therefore, we are interested, but also whose background story is really significant and relevant, and so much of what they did and discussed and achieved in the first 50 years of the 20th century turned out to be seminal and prophetic. And so therefore, what you can do is you can talk about the art, but with so much more vocabulary, because you can place the images or the sculpture or the paintings or the watercolors, which incidentally, art needs help sometimes. It needs the right metaphors. It needs the right context in order for you to be able to fully engage. I mean, what is art after all? It's an act of illusion in the traditional sense. It's turning the three-dimensional world, in the case of a painting, into a two-dimensional one and adding poetry to it in some way. But a lot of people cannot get there unless they have a bit of help, like I need to when tasting wine. So I think our job is to try and find a means by which this particular art form that we have devoted our lives to can expand in relevance to others.
You talked about your practice focusing on 500 years of British art. We've discussed how you kind of highlight the Bloomsbury Group, but, a great deal of your specialization is around portraiture, right? What makes portraiture so compelling?
I think that the reason that I find portraiture so compelling, and it is true, I mean, I have spent a lot of my professional career involved in that particular genre, is because it's a combination of two, possibly three entities rather than just one. What do I mean by that? So if I'm painting your portrait and I'm looking at you now, I'm thinking how I might do it. I've got my own ideas. I see the lamp behind you. I see an image of a Rembrandt hanging on your wall. I think, okay, I can express you and your features and your demeanor and your gestures in a certain way. I've got my own idea. I've got my own agenda. But if you are paying for this portrait, and in the majority of cases there is a paying commissioner, there's the subject or the subject's family or an institution, they have their own expectations. So out of that comes a sort of dialogue. And I find that sometimes adds a lot more richness and interest to a work of art, the fusion of two minds rather than just one. Painting a face that's talking and has expectations is different to doing a plate of oranges. And then you have that third entity, which is the society to which you belong. And you are both individuals who are trying to say something using the medium of an individual. And there are things like, fashion and cultural nuances, which inevitably you will include in the portrayal of humanity in your day, like the background, like the posture. And also the facial expression. I mean, what is so fascinating about portraiture is how every period has its own look, and it makes it a great game. And also every artist has their own way of portraying a face. In fact, I sometimes think that portraiture tells you more about the artist than it does about the subject. And so for example, there's a Velasquez face, which is sort of sometimes, intense and painterly. There's a Rembrandtesque face, which normally sort of at its best emerges compellingly out of the gloom, and there's the transparency of Gainsborough, and there's the classicism of Reynolds, and there is the sprezzatura strokes of someone like Sargent. But they all have their own worldview of the face. And we, as human beings, even if we're not interested in art, have a capacity to read faces. And we have done from the cradle. Not only people you recognize, but different expressions and nuances. So what we can do is, and I always think it's a really good way of people starting to look at art history and to learn to look at one artist compared to another, is look at faces, because we have the sensibilities and nerve endings to recognize faces and the different aspects of facial expression, unlike other areas of life. So it's a really valuable way, I think, of having a broader vocabulary and reaching what it is that an artist is trying to do, given that we're already quite good at it.
A lot of these historic portraits are of people of privilege and stature, and some of those have value just because of the subject. But a lot of times we'll come across portraits that it's of someone whose identity has just been totally lost to time. But that doesn't mean it's any less compelling of a portrait.
No, I mean, portraits take all shapes and forms. And the historical portrait, the famous figure, the hierarchical image, has a place. And the earliest form of portraiture, which goes back thousands of years, is the head of the monarch. It's an expression of power, or the head of the ruler or the emperor. And then gradually, as society progresses, and it starts with the Romans particularly, I think, and then it flowers in the Renaissance, we get more of an interest in the individual. And sometimes the expression of humanity can be so arresting, so enduring, that it remains as relevant to our eye as it did in the day. And that has nothing to do with power playing portraiture. It's to do rather like with great poetry or with great music. It's capturing the human condition. And the Renaissance, particularly in Italy, is full of such examples, with artists like Raphael and Titian, and mind-blowing images. People who, when the elevator doors open, you could see today, and you end up standing next to. And I on more than one occasion, I've stood next to a Caravaggio or a Rembrandt or a Titian, thinking, I've seen you before. I know where it is. It's in Italy in the 16th or 17th century.
Especially those Velasquez or El Greco works where they're wearing eyeglasses, and it seems so odd that 16th century someone's wearing eyeglasses. I'm like, wow, this looks like somebody that could have stepped off the elevator in the art history department, right?
Yeah, I mean, I know the El Greco that you're thinking about, and one in particular, which I think is at the Met. And yes, it is absolutely astonishing how a pair of glasses just sort of rafts you back in a heartbeat 500 years, and you're standing in front of that individual. And I think you've touched upon what it is. Faces are really emotive things, and despite the process of evolution, frankly, we haven't changed that much.
So, it seems like one of the greatest skills someone in your position can have is understanding the hidden potential value of an object, regardless of what its current appearance is. And so, I'm thinking of, I've heard you tell stories about particular pieces, whether that's a mold-covered portrait of Dickens on ivory, or even one of the Tommy Tomlin sculptures that's currently in your show that was moss-covered in a garden. Sometimes it's difficult to know what you have in front of you.
Well, certainly, because age itself is a creative force, and I always say that the history of art is not a history of what was painted, but what remains. And there is so much that was produced that has now perished. And particularly when you're looking at works, and we do a lot with Tudor paintings, with 16th century works of art, particularly when you're dealing with things that are 400 or 500 years old. The paint goes through various chemical processes. Paintings become tarnished and dirty with time. Sometimes the varnish needs to be changed every 30 or 40 years, depending on where it is, in order to be able to even just see it. So it depends where you are on that cycle. And then things happen. Tragically things happen. If you go through the National Gallery today and look at some of their early works by Titian, you will see how ham-fisted restoration, not necessarily by the National Gallery decades ago, but by others, have removed glazes, subtle areas of shadow, the junction between one shape or form and another. But when occasionally you do come across a work in really great condition, the tendency is to call it a really great work of art, because condition, when dealing with ancient paintings, is so key. And a lot of the art of art dealing, if one could express it like that, in old paintings, is being able to look through the dirt, look beyond the damage, and see and try and determine whether it's a work of quality, and probably just as important, whether it can be revived.
I know that issue that you brought up there with the overzealous restoration, cutting through glazes that were intended to be there is kind of a hot button issue for some people in that world, because a lot of times we think of, well, we're just going to strip off this varnish until we get to a bright image. But you really kind of have to understand, in that period with that artist, if they were using glazes to provide a sfumato or, provide a particular darkness, even though our world today, we want high contrast and bright, that's not necessarily what the original intent of the painting was, right?
Absolutely right. And there are so many paintings that have lost their poetry, their subtlety, their power as a result of individuals over the last few hundred years, thinking that they were restoring it, bringing it back to its original appearance, but in fact, accidentally savaging a surface and removing what could and should be there.
I think probably even worse than the removal is the poor overpainting, correct? I mean, that can really throw the dogs off the trail in terms of finding an authentic work, right? I mean, the poor hand that is obscuring what was authentic work can really cause some confusion when it comes to trying to authenticate a piece.
So what happens with restoration is historically, let's talk about the most basic form of restoration. You remove the varnish, and in so doing, with any luck, you return it to its original appearance. But very often, because of the solvents, because of the abrasion used, because of misunderstanding, I think less so now, but a lot more in the past, particularly, in fact, in the early 20th century, when the art market was getting going and people wanted to represent pictures. And then when one is looking at the bare bones of a painting with the varnish removed, with areas of loss sometimes, in fact, very often, and areas of, let's say, dark varnish or sfumato effects, which as a result of their vulnerability have been removed, you then have the job of having to replace those areas. And there are varying degrees of quality with which that is done. And you have your extremely sophisticated restorer, particularly over the last 30, 40 years, who will judiciously touch in areas of loss with the hope of returning to what the artist intended. But some can be art conservation equivalent of the builder from hell. And they will slap paint on to patch up an area, stand back, see that paint doesn't quite work, and then put in more paint around it. A painting which might be actually decent and even very fine can be lost beneath an accumulation of layers of ham-fisted overpaint.
Philip, for years, you've served on the Antiques Roadshow. You've written books about finding lost treasures. It's a joy to watch Fake or Fortune on the BBC, where you kind of take our hands and walk us through these processes of finding the true value of these lost pieces. Can you talk about some of the challenges you have faced in trying to establish the value for an object? I mean, what are some of the more memorable cases that's either been, really a surprise, or, you feel like you've made a super compelling argument and you just kind of run up against a wall?
Fake or Fortune, and we've now done, I think it'll be 45 programs by the time the next series comes out, which I believe is September, involves us dealing with works of art that are owned by individuals who, for whatever reason, are unable to determine whether they're real or not. And so in that process of doing so, we subject it to all sorts of things, but primarily provenance research, trying to find out where it came from in order to be able to hopefully take it back to the day it might have left the artist's studio that we hope it's by. It's stylistic analysis, looking at the brushstrokes, the colours, the tones, the approach to subject matter. Is that how Van Gogh did it? Is that how Jan van Eyck crafted a face or did a finger? Then there is the science, the technology, which is becoming increasingly sophisticated. The data has massively swelled. By that I mean we now know so much more about how different artists worked, what materials they used, when those materials were invented. For instance, we had a picture which was purportedly by Chagall, Marc Chagall, the 20th century painter of dreams, amongst other things, but I always think of him as a sort of figurative, abstract poster painter, really. By that I mean we had all sorts of, when I was a kid, we always had seemed to be Chagalls on the wall wherever I looked, including at school, I remember. And this painting had been bought for £100,000 by a couple from the north of England through an interior designer, and it purported to be a Belarus period Chagall from the late teens, early 20s. And we subjected it to technical analysis, and in particular looked at the blue in the painting and found out that it was phthalocyanine blue. Now, the fact that we were able to establish that is something that one couldn't have done possibly 20, 30 years ago. Phthalocyanine blue was discovered and not really used until about 20 or 30 years after the painting had to have been done. Right. So that was a real gotcha. What I think has become increasingly a phenomenon is the capacity to rule out attributions as a result of science. But there are many instances where we, in Fake or Fortune, have garnered all the information, sometimes totally convincingly. It happened in the case of a Renoir with the Wildenstein Institute. It happened with a Winston Churchill painting with the expert involved, who's written the main book. And you garner all this information. To me, it's just astonishingly obvious that this painting is right. But for whatever reason, they reject it. And these individuals have real power. The art world, because we deal in art is an illusion. Art is a rather mystical thing. The art world relies upon these individuals, some of whom are very good at their jobs, others who might be less so. And they have the power of Roman emperors. Thumbs up, it's the real deal. It can be worth hundreds of thousands, millions of pounds. Fake, it's worth whatever you can get for it. And rather like a jury, you can never totally predict what the outcome is going to be. I find that most baffling, but also fascinating thing, that we live in a world of art, and art is a human creation. And however much pragmatic evidence you've managed to garner, in the end, whether it is or it isn't, is still a decision made emotionally by an individual. So in the case of the Winston Churchill picture, which we found out where it was painted, when it was painted, it had come from a member of the family. I mean, look, every box was ticked. It was turned down, but then 2 years later, a photograph of Winston Churchill emerged at Chartwell with a picture behind him. So in that instance, they had no choice but to accept it. In the case of the Renoir, we still haven't managed to prove that. I believe it is right. But I have to tell you, one of the problems is, particularly if it happens on television, if an individual or group meet and consider and produce a verdict and argue for the reasons behind it, it is extremely difficult to overturn it subsequently. We don't really have a court of appeal.
One of the most heavy-handed consequences was for the Chagall.
Correct. Okay, in the case of the Chagall, that was a real problem, and it ended sadly. The picture was actually seized by the Chagall committee, and I still don't know. This was about 8 or 9 years ago, I believe. I still don't know what has happened to it, but I know that they do in France have the power to destroy works of art, and there was talk of it being burned.
Wow. When you guys are going through on the program the analysis of a particular painting, one of the common things that we see is X-raying of the piece, and one of the things I've seen over and over again is this notion of, I want to say it's postamente. It's this, the changing mind of the artist. He's had a second thought, and that a forgery, typically there is no change. That's not the intent for a forgery. There's an idea or there's something that's being copied, and you don't see any of those changes. I find it really interesting when they X-ray Vermeers. They don't even find preliminary drawings under there. That's can you talk a little bit about what is exposed and what it tells us about how the artists work?
Well, in some instances, artists, and when I say some instances, I mean probably the majority of instances, great old master painters, don't hatch the composition in its entirety upon the canvas. It doesn't just go from the head to the surface of the painting, from the brain to the surface of the painting. There is normally some sort of gestation process, some sort of means by which the artist arrives at a solution. And that involves painting over first ideas or second ideas. They're called pentimenti. And I think loosely translated from the Italian, it means regret. And not only can these be discovered very often with X-ray and sometimes infrared, but they will also in themselves be an indication of authenticity, because they show that something is a process by which a composition has been arrived at. And a slavish copy is not going to do that. Now, it's not totally conclusive, but it's an extra dimension in the process of authenticating, because it allows a bit more thought and dialogue about how and why that the painter has come up with that particular idea. And the more you know about the process and can latch it on to the work of that particular artist, the more full the argument is. But some artists, it is true, use very, very few pentiments. And I haven't looked enough Vermeers to know whether or not he's an example of that. But what wouldn't surprise me, because they are so arithmetically worked out, those compositions by Vermeer, we may well have the work of the camera obscura, where the image is reflected with such exactitude, and he's worked it out with such clarity, that there may not be that deliberation process. Pentiments, artists' changing of minds, can be a useful process, but it's not in itself conclusive.
There was a period, I guess about 10 years ago, where a lot of authentication committees were disbanding. And my impression was that you never know exactly whether the story that is coming forward is the truth or how someone wants to portray. But it sounds like some of these authentication committees were becoming leery of litigation. If they were to say, sorry, we don't think it's the real deal, that opened them up to the risk of someone suing them because it's affecting the value of their work. These days, it's kind of tricky figuring out how to get your piece authenticated, right? I mean, who has the final say, because not every artist has an authentication committee. Not every artist has a catalog raisonné. How do you navigate a world where it seems like authentication varies from artist to artist?
It's extremely difficult. In the case of certain 20th century artists, it's a real problem. I mean, Warhol is an example of this. The only hope you have in those situations, when the committee, for whatever reason, won't come up with an opinion, is for you, the individual who has this painting, to get or try and get together a consensus from individuals who the art world listen to. And if it's well enough argued and the individuals are sufficiently recognized, there is a chance that it will be taken seriously. It may not make as much as if it were in the catalogue raisonné, the sort of the Bible of the artist's works, but you can go some way to achieving that. But it is a problem, and it's done because of litigation, because these committees, these individuals, these foundations don't want to necessarily put their head over the parapet. Why risk it? It does hold up art history. It's a problem. It's a sort of it's an anti-intellectual concept, really. When you've got the individuals who are able to have a clear view or a view on whether or not something is part of an artist's output or expression, and then are gagged from being able to do so, that's not healthy.
Well, let me ask you one last question. Do you have a white whale? I mean, is there a particular missing painting that you would love to find one day? I mean, I think any of us would want to find Rembrandt's Storm on the Sea of Galilee, but is there a particular piece that you're keeping your eye out for, or is it nothing specific?
It's nothing specific, because what I've come to the conclusion about is that there is always something out there which may not be recorded, but is an exciting manifestation of art history. And it can take so many different shapes and forms. We just simply do not know how much Van Gogh did. We've got a good idea, but there are going to be things which are not recorded, which his brother doesn't know about, or his brother didn't know about. There are going to be sketches and paintings possibly half finished by really great painters that might have been finished off by other artists, and perhaps one day those later editions, disfiguring editions, those bits can be reversed. You have to, I think, accept the fact that there is a lot more art out there than we know about, and I have absolutely no doubt that over the next 100 years, all sorts of things will come out of the woodwork. And the most important thing to be is open-minded, is to have the sort of the innocence to accept, and then the skepticism to question, because even with artists like Van Gogh and Rembrandt and Leonardo, we cannot ever be in a position where we know everything that those painters and artists will have produced. And history has a curious way, rather like the sea, of throwing things up when you least expect it.
Well, Philip, I really appreciate your time today. You have the current show, Bloomsbury Stud, The Art of Stephen Tomlin, up at Philip Mould Company on Pall Mall in London through August 11th. And Fake Your Fortune, season 11 is, what are we thinking, September?
We think September, yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Philip, I can't thank you enough for being willing to talk about your work and, authentication and just the treasures that underlie layers of yellowed varnish.
That's one way of putting it.
Right.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.